Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to the panel discussion on sufficiency. We are a few minutes late, but we needed to gather all the speakers, so everyone is here now. And I just wanted to say it's a great pleasure. I will be moderating this session. My name is Barbara Dubach. I'm CEO and founder of Engageability, but I'm also head of knowledge transfer of a national research program on sustainable economy. And I also sit on the board of Innovate for Nature. So I wear several hats, and today I will be the moderator of the session. I think what is interesting, we will be talking about the concept of sufficiency. And it's interesting because I think it's a topic that comes and goes again, and it has received again attention as an effective, if not indispensable, climate change mitigation strategy, also by IPCC 2022, and we'll hear more about it from the speakers. I think also it still remains as a misunderstood and marginal concept, especially also in business and policy environments. So this is really the objective of today, that we'll talk about the different approaches of sufficiency and also see whether it can be a powerful tool or a powerful concept for innovative and equitable ways to deliver well-being for all. So it's a great pleasure to quickly share with you who are the distinguished speakers today. I'll start over there with Carlos Alvarez Pereira from the Club of Rome. We have Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker. We have Hege Sabjörnsson, I hope I say this correct, from the Inca Group. We have Julia Steinberger from the University of Lausanne and Luis Akenji, I hope I don't know how this is correct, from the Hot or Cool Institute. So with that, and with no further ado, I'd like to start, and we will do, the sequence will be as such. We'll have short input presentations by all the speakers, and then we have a panel discussion where you will be also able to ask some questions. So this will be an interactive sessions. And I'd like to start with Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker. He is a German scientist and politician. And in 1991, he became the founding president of the Wuppertal Institute, and he was also a member of the German Bundestag and served as co-president of the Club of Rome. He has been working in the space of sustainability for many, many years, and we are really pleased to have Ernst here. So Ernst, I give the floor to you.
Do you happen to know if my presentation is here?
I think so. It should come.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I have a certain hope. No. This is the wrong. No. I gave somebody my new presentation. This is an old one, 2 months old, and is not what I'm saying. I mean, in the worst case, I speak without the
I think they are preparing it, Ernst. I see them up there. So
I'm sorry, the taxi took 20 minutes from the station to be here. So I was really late, and I apologize for that. Anyway, essentially what I'm saying is that sufficiency is extremely unpopular. I have not seen anybody in the environmental discussions hailing sufficiency. And that indeed is the problem. Because everybody wants to have more. And this has always been, over centuries, the objective of governments, of business, of consumers, and everybody wanted more. And that destroys our planet. But nobody wants to know that because it is so extremely embarrassing. That indeed is what we have to discuss. I think this is now correct, yes. So next, please. Or can I put, yes. Okay, yeah, sufficiency is not popular, I'm afraid. People prefer being rich. You know, people in Africa prefer living like Europeans or North Americans, understandable. Those are the footprints. In America, they are big. In Europe also mostly, but in Africa not. So the intention of African countries is being as rich, more or less, as the Europeans or the Americans are. But if the typical footprints, ecological footprints of America were spread over the globe, then we would need 6 planets, Earth. We've got only 1. This is on biodiversity. We can count the body weights of land-living vertebrates. And then we find out, essentially, the animals for slaughter make up 67%. And we, humans, are also vertebrates, another 30%. Remaining, we have 3% for wild animals. This is the reality of today. And of course, it's a disaster for biodiversity. This is a cartoon, of course, saying the biodiversity collapse is the worst that we have to live with. Well, Pope Francis wrote a wonderful encyclical called Laudato Si, and there he declares that the current philosophy of greed, relentless competition, and wild acceleration is destroying our common home, meaning our planet. The Pope said so. At the Club of Rome, we had a fairly courageous book called Come On. It was essentially written for the 50th anniversary of the existence of the Club of Rome. And there we are quoting Pope Francis. We learned a lot from him. But in addition to that, we also said we need something like a new enlightenment. You know, the old enlightenment was wonderful for growth, growth, growth. Okay, but this could destroy our planet. So we need a new kind of enlightenment. For that, it is helpful to look at what Herman Daly, earlier years, he was the chief economist of the World Bank. And he said, we have to distinguish between the former world, then 100, 200 years ago, that's the empty world, empty from humans. And now the human economy is sort of, everything is human economy. So the typical answer is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We are very proud of that. And everybody thinks, now we are looking for sustainability. The question is, are these SDGs sustainable? No, they are not. You know, 11 of those are essentially aggressive growth imperatives. And that's they call sustainable. It's not sustainable. And 3 out of 17 are ecological: climate, oceans, and biodiversity. So instead of the square kind of that I showed a moment ago, we better have a pyramid where the basis is the natural resource base, and then economics and social things. that is more realistic. The unpleasant thing is that if the ecological things like oceans, biodiversity, etc., are collapsing, the whole pyramid is collapsing, but nobody wants to know that. Well, our Limits to Growth book of the Club of Rome, more than 50 years ago, the Club of Rome has published the limits to growth. But people don't want limits to growth. It's also unpopular. And the question is, has the book reduced the speed of growth? No, the opposite happened. An enormous increase. And it was always celebrated as a great success. That's the reality today. People simply don't like limits to growth. What is the tragedy behind it all is that there is always a strong relativity between per capita GDP and the greenhouse gas emissions. So countries with little consumption have little CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a clear, it's always, yes, I'm stopping in a moment. So the rest is, of course, hot Europe, etc. I don't go into that. And the increase of world population makes it extremely difficult to stabilize climate and biodiversity. And this is the development of CO2, etc. But the good news is on this picture. Solar energy has become 300 times cheaper over the past 40 years, meaning stopping global warming is now affordable. And photovoltaics has become much cheaper, and nuclear ever more expensive. And then in a book which I wrote with a number of Australians is Factor 5, we can become 5 times more efficient in energy and all materials, meaning the circular economy. This is technically absolutely possible. We have to make it profitable. So one last thing is, how many kilowatt hours do you need to lift a bucket of water from sea level to the top of Mount Everest? The answer is 1/4 of a kilowatt hour. So it is absolutely doable. In short, sufficiency can be needed for the rich. Poor countries and poor families would benefit mostly from more efficient use of minerals and energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernst, for sharing your thoughts and also highlighting why sufficiency might be not popular. And I think during the panel discussion, we will afterwards discuss also solutions or approaches. How can we really move towards that? With that, I'd like to introduce and ask Carlos to afterwards start his presentation. Carlos Alvarez Pereira, he's the Vice President of the Club of Rome. He has more than 30 years of experience in research and innovation, entrepreneurship, and business management. He's also an advisor to the UNESCO Chair on Global Understanding for Sustainability and many others. So, Carlos, we look forward to hearing from you and to hearing what the Club of Rome is doing today.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I want to build on what my dear colleague and friend Ernst just explained. and go a bit further to ask some difficult questions. The first, starting from the fact that as much as we know for now, that thing called sustainable development is an oxymoron, or a unicorn, if you prefer, a mythological animal that nobody has actually seen yet, which will lead to deeper questions about what could we do. This graph was produced by our colleagues in the Club of Rome, Bill Rees and Mathis Wackernagel, who invented the concept of ecological footprint, to show where are the countries in terms of the two variables, ecological footprint measured in number of Earths, which would be needed to sustain our lifestyle, and Human Development Index, an index developed by the United Nations, which is a composite indicator mixing GDP per capita, education level, and health indicators per country. And you see this graph is a perfect representation of the oxymoron. So all the dots, all the colored dots that you are seeing, which represent countries, should be inside the green rectangle. And as you can see, no one is there. Not only that, the dots which are closer, some countries measured in this way, which of course is very simplistic, you know. Both HDI, the Human Development Index, is this a good reflection of the state of well-being of people? Well, there are many dimensions which are not considered. Ecological footprint is also a reduced perspective on our footprint, of our footprint on Earth, but it's useful enough to see that the development, what we call quote unquote development of countries and societies, is a process by which countries go. If we animated this graph over time, would be that countries going from state of low HDI, low ecological footprint, to a state of high level of Human Development Index, go along that curve. They don't get into the green box. They become countries with high HDI, but also high ecological footprint. So this seems like a dead end, and this is not to create anxiety, it's to get a deeper reflection on why we are here and what we can do about it. Also take into account that the countries which are closer to, in this definition, to sustainable development are not the typical ones that we are looking at as examples. Sorry to say that Switzerland is not close to sustainable development. The ecological footprint of this wonderful country is very high. And in general, Europe, the Nordic countries are not an example of sustainable development. They have also very high ecological footprint. And this is, it's just a consolation to say, oh, but the footprint of European countries is lower, significantly lower than the one of the US. That's true, but it is not enough by far. And the issue is, of course, very much related to what Ernst said, that sufficiency is not popular. It is also linked to our mental frameworks, because this graph has a fundamental trick. It's good to provoke, but we need to engage into deeper questions about the graph, in particular, that being sustainable is not an individual mission of countries. It's not a race among countries, so that, of course, what happens in the US is not independent from what happens in most of the world, because behind this, there is the whole set of extractivism from most of the world to the so-called developed world, and the framework in which we consider that some countries are developed and others are developing. The approach that we are now, I mean, among other things, in the Club of Rome, we do plenty of things. Some of them are related to policy making. We published last year a book titled Earth for All, trying to answer the question of what kind of policies would be suitable to rebalance human well-being, equitable human well-being for all, with the planetary boundaries. But a big dimension that we have been that is still missing is the cultural dimension of how do we change the mindsets? How do we, to speak more properly, how do we create the appropriate conditions for the mindsets to shift to a state, a cultural state of affairs in which we do not long anymore for growth and growth and growth, when we realize that actually well-being is not driven by material consumption. It's driven by the health of our relationships, the quality of our relationships with other humans, with life at large, and with time, which is a completely different matter. And it's something in which we could learn from ancient cultures, because this discovery that modern science is producing as a discovery is at best a rediscovery of what ancient wisdom had already understood since millennia. It's in relationships that well-being can be achieved. We know that this creates, I mean, we live, you know, particularly in Europe, in a state of, for many, especially in younger generations, in a state of eco-anxiety. And we have to address that if we want to do something, to bring to people something different from freedom as consumption, as it is understood today, to freedom as creativity. What we are starting to propose is that we have to engage in processes of learning across the chasms between countries and cultures, across the chasms between generations, across the chasms between disciplines, to engage in the process of mutual metamorphosis, by which we know that, for instance, both African and European countries need to do something very substantially different if we want to achieve this state of equitable human well-being within a healthy planet. But we don't know yet what. And we also know that it has to be something different from the developed countries teaching to the developing countries how they have to develop. Something very different from that. This is the invitation that we are developing in the Club of Rome in a program I lead called The Fifth Element, and the title of the program is deliberately intriguing, but also deliberate, to give the meaning that you didn't know until now, but you are all part of this program, because the fifth element is life, life at large, life with a capital L, where we try to understand what could be the conditions for the cultural transformations which are required to happen, in a very open invitation to everybody to engage in this process of that we call mutual metamorphosis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. And we will certainly learn more about the fifth element later in the discussion. I'd like to introduce Julia Steinberger. She's professor of ecological economics at the University of Lausanne, and she studies the relationship between the use of resources and performance of societies. She's also an author of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, contributing to also the report's discussion of climate mitigation pathways. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Barbara. I hope you can hear me. And it's nice actually for a change to be on a panel where I agree on some basics, but disagree rather fundamentally with the previous speakers. So let me just explain, sorry, we don't know each other. Hi, Sylvie. I think one of the things I'd like to get away from is this idea that our current consumer society has anything to do with fundamental human nature, or is a sort of historical imperative that we can't ever get away from. I think that we can understand these things through historical analysis, for instance. And I also think that we need to get away from this idea of development and resource use or economic growth as completely congruent, because when we analyze the system in a bit more complexity, we find that these relationships aren't as strong as they often appear at the surface. Okay, that being said, I'd like to talk a bit more about sufficiency. So for me, sufficiency is cutting with both edges of the scissor. We have efficiency, we have alternative production technologies, and we also need to reduce resource use. But reducing resource use is not a goal in itself. Sufficiency is the goal of reducing resource use with a purpose. So you're familiar with reduce, reuse, recycle. This is probably is too well known and kind of annoying at this point. But I'd like to go back to what the French association Negawatt, and if you're not familiar with them, they have a new European project with scenarios based on their framework called Clever, which I think is very important for us to engage with. And they have another triad, which is sufficiency, efficiency, renewables. And the idea of sufficiency is that you use your resources with a purpose. The purpose is to avoid both underconsumption, so deprivation. The purpose of the resource use matters in sufficiency. We're not talking just about quantity, we're talking about quality, and we're talking about who is using it for what purpose. So we're trying to avoid both underconsumption and overconsumption. Now, what does this mean? So as of very recently, we have a definition of sufficiency that was published in the IPCC. It was provided by Dr. Yamina Saheb, one of the lead authors. And this is something, by the way, that the Americans didn't want to see and other countries did want to see. So that makes it particularly fun. And so it really got in at the last minute. That's why it's footnote number 59. Sufficiency policies are a set of measures and daily practices that avoid demand for energy, materials, and land and water while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. So avoiding demand is clearly important. Delivering well-being is also important. And here we also have the inclusion of planetary boundaries, meaning a large spectrum of major environmental crises, not just climate change. So that's nice to see. Now, delivering human well-being might sound a bit esoteric. I would like to argue that it is not. We need material, energy, resource, services to live. But how much do we need is an open question. And people like Narasimha Rao, for instance, of Yale University, have been trying to develop frameworks that estimate how much is enough. And this is something that we can do research on. So Narasimha Rao has developed this decent living standards framework. And this is something, if we go to the next slide, I can do it myself. This is awesome. Thank you. So I'm just going to present two research results that we did in this area. The first one is where we modeled decent living energy based on Narasimha's framework. And so the idea here is that you basically have a number of energy services. In this case, we're modeling energy. One should and could do it for resources more broadly. You have energy services that correspond to decent living standards for everybody. Now, what we're doing in this model is we assume efficient technologies for all. We assume everybody has access to high tech or efficient tech, at least, within plausible existing technologies. We don't resort to any magic, unlike other IPCC models, that would be available to everybody on planet Earth. The second point is we have sufficient energy services. So these are delivered in the right ways, for dwelling, for transport, for communication, for health, for all of this stuff, right? We're taking into account geography and demography to the extent possible, so different climate conditions, urban, rural, different household sizes, different age structures. And we have total equality. So this is a very simple model. It's also utopian if you're on a certain part of the income ladder, or dystopian if you're on the other. But we have total equality, no under or overconsumption. That's why the Americans don't like it, by the way. They didn't like the word overconsumption. I wonder why. And what we find is that sufficient energy for all in 2050 would be possible at less than half of our current final energy consumption, despite population growth. So this is not a technical impossibility. This is not, some kind of overwhelming physical task. It is entirely feasible. The question is, what are the economic structures and power structures that stand in our way or not? The second research result that I want to show is based on not on sort of a utopian model, which is still based on existing technologies. I mean, our utopia is not that utopian. But the second one is based on existing data. So existing international data, where we look again at which countries are able to deliver human need satisfaction, in health, education, and others, at low energy use. And again, it would be interesting to do this for other kinds of resources. And we were able to identify, to sort of characterize what kind of socioeconomic factors enable meeting needs at low energy use and what kind of factors make it harder, okay? And things that make it easier are things like public service quality. Now, if there's one thing that you remember from anything that I say, is that public services are the linchpin between well-being and low resource use. I'll just say it again. Public services are the linchpin between well-being and resource use. We see it in this study, but we see it at multiple dimensions in multiple ways that we've researched this topic. It just comes up over and over again from the data. So healthcare matters, electricity, sanitation, transport. So basically network infrastructure access matters a lot. Electricity access matters a lot. Democracy, it turns out, is a positive factor, so that's kind of nice. And economic equity is also a positive factor. Now, we have a couple of negative factors that also popped out in the data. And again, this is not based on ideology. This is based on, just like throwing a bunch of numbers into a hopper and analyzing them in a sort of decent way. Extractivism is a very negative factor. Now, this is something that people know from economics, so it's known as the resource curse, as Dutch disease. The more directly dependent an economy is on extractive sectors, whether it's mining or fossil fuels or other, the worse it will be at delivering good social outcomes for its population at low resource use, okay? And the second one, which we are kind of surprised by, to be honest, is economic growth above a moderate income. So the pursuit of economic growth is something that makes it harder for societies to achieve needs at low resource use. But so this sort of tells us a bit where we should be aiming and where we should be going away from. Now, again, growth-based and consumer-based societies are not a historical inevitability. However, they are strongly associated with power concentration and imperatives of our current economic structures. And so this is something that I think we have to take very, very seriously indeed. If we want to achieve sufficiency, it means going up against power. This is not just about replacing GDP as an indicator. GDP as an indicator is cute, okay? But what underpins it is much more important, because these are structural growth imperatives that comfort and protect accumulation of wealth and power internationally and internationally. So when we're talking about facing the challenge of achieving decent living standards at low resource use for the vast majority of people on the planet, if not all, we're talking about a challenge of facing wealth and power accumulation and inequalities, and facing these economic structures. My proposal would be that this requires policies that are much more aligned with degrowth and post-growth policy proposals. I also think it means challenging the market supremacy of our current systems and moving much more towards economic democracy, so towards structures where citizens have a say in what our markets are doing, what production and consumption is doing, in a very, very strong and fundamental way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia, for your strong words and also based on some facts and figures. I think that's interesting and will be an interesting discussion point. I'd like to hand over to Louis Akenji. He is Managing Director of the think tank Hot or Cool, and also a transformational economics commissioner with the Earth for All project, which we have heard already from Carlos before, and also a lead author of the 1.5-degree lifestyles towards a fair consumption space for all. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start with a little bit of a detour because Julia has already said better what I wanted to say, so I'm just going to move away from that. We need a new vocabulary. We need a new dictionary that captures the circumstances under which we are operating, the challenges of the times, and the struggle to find solutions. We need a new dictionary that is more honest about the difficulties that we face. We've established, for example, that we have a climate crisis, biodiversity, resource, and so on. That is very clear. There's a bigger risk that it is not even this that is going to be our undoing. It's the refusal to reframe, to fundamentally accept the reality that is in front of us and change the course that we have baked into our economic and political systems. Why do I say this? Here's a starting point for consideration. In a future where we have a very limited carbon budget, resource budget, and we have a biodiversity crisis, or in a future where the cake or the pie is much smaller, how do you envision a society? How do we distribute this in a way that is fair to everyone? And is it possible that we can transition to that future with the same power dynamics that we have today? I think the answer to that is no. Why? Because the power dynamics we have today are the same dynamics that created the problem. It means that the strong will get more. All the investments that we're talking about into renewable energy, there will be investments by the rich. All the new technologies will be patented by the rich. All the exploitation of natural resources will still come from places that are powerless. And the pockets of poverty will get even poorer and start migrating to borders where they are not accepted. This is what we're baking into our society. This is also what leads me to say we're not going to solve this ecological crisis without addressing the social tensions that we have in our system. If that is not a starting point, all of this is just an exercise in technology promotion and economic growth ideologies. It also means a few people have started talking about new social contracts. The recognition that the sort of institutions of governance we have today, which were created in the 50s, 60s, 70s, can no longer contain and address the sort of issues that we have. So we need to rethink not only power dynamics, but the institutions that we're entrusting to charter our course forward. And I dare to say at the Horuku Institute, we're exploring a number of options with partners, and I'll mention just two of them here that would be quite fundamental to what a new society or what principles of a new society could look like. The first one here is creating a fair consumption space. It's quite appropriate because we are the Resources Forum. How do we make sure that it's not only production for the wealthy, but also meeting well-being needs for everyone, and especially the needs of the people at the bottom? We've talked a lot about overconsumption, although we are not addressing it. While there's a need to reduce consumption among most of us sitting here, there's also people who suffer when we put in place the wrong kind of policies or legislation. What it simply does is it transfers the burden somewhere to Peru or to Congo, and we think we're solving the problem here. We're just playing a game of whack-a-mole where we're transferring the problems somewhere else, and we sit comfortably in our clean, decent houses and cars. To create a fair consumption space, we also need to consider the needs of those at the bottom and to make sure that whatever mechanisms we're putting in place do not have most of them falling below that social floor. And that space between, the ceiling and the floor is where we have room for negotiation of who consumes more than the other. The second one is something Julia has articulated so very clearly. the need for a certain universality in how we approach fundamental needs, or what others would call universal basic services. If we've agreed, for example, that everyone needs shelter, everyone needs food, everyone needs to travel and see their friends or grandmas, these are quite fundamental, not only to function in society, but to our well-being. And if we can agree on this, we can also agree that these should not be open to financial speculation. It means that we need to find different ways of provisioning that acknowledge that these are not places where we gamble, but spaces where we support each other, where we build communities, and where our governance and our resources are directed. I get back to the question. In a future where we have a tighter budget, how do we distribute that in a way that we all meet our needs in a fair way and that we do not destroy our host planet? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Luis. I think this, your fair consumption space reminded me a little bit also of the donut economics, which goes in a similar direction.
We all eat donuts.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. So last but not least, I'd like to introduce Hege Sabjørnsen. She's the Global Circular Strategy Leader at Inca Group, and she has been working at IKEA since more than 8 years in various positions such as Global Partnership Advisor, Head of Sustainability UK and Ireland. And I think it will be interesting to hear from a corporate perspective in how far is sufficiency an interesting concept.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's really exciting to be here. And I think maybe you could even spot like who's the odd one out on the panel. It's not really an obvious conversation to be part of as a private sector company. And I think it's really important to say that, of course, I am not, and we are as a company, not experts in sufficiency. The esteemed panelists here are, in fact, the experts on sufficiency. And we have more questions than we have answers at this point in time. But it's really critical that we participate in these conversations and we start to step into not only new spaces, but also uncomfortable conversations that might challenge us in good ways and also sometimes maybe beyond what's comfortable. And I just want to share that, of course, I'm not here speaking on behalf of business. I'm here as a practitioner, as someone who has worked in corporate sustainability for many years, who's come from a space of social entrepreneurship for 6 years before that, and having learned and really practiced the hard way of how to develop and deliver purpose-led social objectives alongside trying to maintain a profitable business, which is no small feat, has to be said. And of course, a couple of just overall messages on the role of business, maybe to start. Business plays a particular unique role in that at its best, it can drive resources, ingenuity, creativity in driving services, goods, behavior change, actions and solutions that we need at this point to not just initiate new movements to decarbonize societies or close the loop on materials, but also to normalize behaviors that might so far not be the norm. And we have an opportunity to use our platform for those types of behaviors. But also needless to say in this context, at its worst, business is also extractive and doesn't necessarily fulfill its purpose as adding value to society. And it's also very important to highlight that dimension of the role of business. And also at this point, that's not what we're discussing today, but it's important to highlight that, of course, directors and board of directors have a fiduciary duty to deliver profit, but not necessarily the same legal responsibility to the planet or to people. That said, I'm here from Inca Group, which has a unique role to play in the IKEA value chain. We are the biggest franchisee with 32 markets, 170,000 co-workers. And we last year had 6 billion interactions with customers across the globe. And that's not 6 billion customers, but they are interaction points where we have an opportunity to influence and reach and communicate and tell stories and provide solutions to people in multiple countries. And it's worth just to say, of course, that we are a purpose-led company, which is something that is not the case for all companies. We're also a private company, so we don't have shareholders. And the vision that we've lived by for 80 years, I'll share a bit about how we're approaching the topic of what might be called sufficiency, although we don't use those terms yet internally, but that we are here to create a better everyday life for the many people. That's translation from Swedish, by the way, so that's why it's a bit awkward. But it's worth to mention that as an 80-year-old company, the reality of the world 80 years ago is not the reality we face today. So the future around resource availability, we know it's not there. We cannot have the same business model or project the same growth trajectories or think in the same way that we did when we first started. The opportunity to bring well-designed, sustainably made furniture at a low cost so that everybody can afford it at a democratic price point is maybe no longer the solution that we thought it might be when we started. So just to take a little bit of an approach to how we approach it today, of course, it's relatively familiar to all of you, I'm sure, in terms of setting science-based targets. It has to start with becoming climate positive, net zero, and circular by 2030. And it's also worth mentioning that although we have set science-based targets that are Paris-aligned across scope 1, 2, and 3, not using carbon offsets, that is not a global business mandatory. That is not a legal level playing field for business. Neither is the science-based targets for nature that are coming up, that also will put us on a trajectory to at least try and contain the business within natural boundaries. So these are some of the level playing fields that we are absolutely advocating for, that business needs to embrace. And nevertheless, so far, they are mostly voluntary, although of course we have the greenhouse gas protocol, we have CSRD compliance coming up, and all sorts of very strong and favorable EU regulations, which we are in favor of. But it's worth also just to say that we've looked at how we can approach what you might call sufficiency from a circularity dimension. That's probably where we are today. That's not to say that's enough. It's not to say that we should end. To become circular by 2030 for a company that's already perfected its efficiency across its value chain is no short of an absolute transformation across the business. And where we started is to look at how our roadmaps towards only using renewable and recycled materials in all our products. We've assessed all our products against circular design capabilities. I would say that's a great start. 9,500 products being assessed against adaptability criteria, recyclability criteria, remanufacturing and others. Is that enough? No, but it's a start. And as an Inca group, where we have 32 markets, we have a unique opportunity to drive behavior change through services and prolonging the life of our products. So we've spent 5 years testing and trialing to try and find not just what customers are ready to participate in, like furniture as a service, but also how to engage customers with language, with narratives, with commercial offers, and what that should look like. And some of the examples of that is that we have a secondhand mall in Sweden called Rotuna. We've had a circuit in our shopping centers where we're bringing the retailers in our network together around prolonging product life and services. And now we're looking at how we can scale a core offer around prolonging product life as a buyback service where all IKEA furniture can be bought back by IKEA and resold. And just some of the examples, again, is a small step in the right direction. I will not suggest that we've reached a tipping point yet. But last year, we had 46.6 million products were given a new life through our buyback and resale services. 32.5 million of those were resold in our stores. We have something called circular hubs, which now rolled out in all our stores. And even just learning how customers engage with language like circular hubs, it's not a narrative that the general populace is familiar with yet. So terms around circularity, what it means, why you would want to participate, all of these things are the things that we need to test and trial, whilst also remaining in the long term commercially viable. We're also learning that actually making an offer that's what we now called meaningful affordability, cost of living crisis is real. We see it is no longer a North and South crisis. There is furniture poverty in multiple countries. Of course, the difference between the North and South are absolutely staggering and phenomenal, but we see it also everywhere. It's important to sort of look at from our end that although we look at the production side, the efficiency on how we produce and how we can responsibly design our products, how we mainstream and scale opportunities for prolonging product life, making that the norm. That is also something that is culturally different depending on the markets. We come up against some very practical limitations around local infrastructure, etc. And that's where we use our advocacy muscle to work with colleagues in Brussels, the European Commission, and make sure that we actually uncover the barriers and blocks for us to scale, but nevertheless also invest in circular capacity across different markets. One example is where we've invested in mattress recycling capacity in Holland that now can recycle 100% of the capacity of used mattresses in Holland. And although that's one product, it's a notoriously difficult stream of materials to recycle, and it generally goes to landfill. But that was only possible through the legislation in Holland that was favorable for a business like this to be able to thrive. And now we're working with other markets to try and scale those models, but also to work with legislators in other jurisdictions around what it takes to scale some of these circular solutions. And then I want to also share at the end that, of course, no one can do this alone. We are a large company, but every market is different. Every legal jurisdiction has different regulations. And we are relying on the partnerships that we meet in our supply chain, in our value chain, but also very clearly we need aligned and unifying definitions and standards. So at the moment, we're working with multiple partners like World Business Council for Sustainable Development on the new Global Circular Protocol, and making sure that we really start to create that level playing field where doing business should be rewarded and it should be too expensive to do the wrong thing. That will move the business case and therefore also move business. I'll think of you there. I'll end on that note. Just also to say, particularly being a consumer-facing brand, the narrative needs to change. The story we tell customers and our co-workers has to be real for them, and they have to be able to understand terms like sufficiency in ways that are relevant to their lives in order to be inspired to move. That's another thing we've learned. So I'll leave it on that message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have heard lots of different inputs, and I think I look forward to the discussion now. Okay, we can either have this or maybe the slide with the names so people are familiar. What I'd like to do is structure the discussion in three, quickly go again into the definition of sufficiency. I think that's important, and also the challenges related to that. Then also tackle some of the challenges and opportunities that you raise. But I think at the end, I want to spend the big part on the role of the different actors so that we can really either achieve what you were saying, Louise, a fair consumption space, or that we can really, others were talking about, yes, we need now solutions. And I think, Ernst, you were also referring to, we need to come away also from a business perspective to make sure that we really ensure that our planet we only have one planet, Earth, right? So that we really can live on this planet and that we look for much more system value. And I'd like to pick up on what you were saying, Julia. You mentioned the definition of the IPCC report where you said, we need to avoid demand for energy, materials, land, and water while delivering human well-being within planetary boundaries. And I think this all sounds very well to us, and we are all in the sustainability space, and most of you as well. But Ernst, you were saying at the beginning, sufficiency is not popular. So sometimes I wonder, we come up with terminologies like sufficiency or sustainability or human well-being, or I just read the well-being economy governance. And I'm wondering whether we are coming up with too many different terminologies so that, people outside this room maybe have no clue what we are talking about. And I don't know whether this is a problem or, how can we make sure that, yes, we are going towards sufficiency or regenerative economy. I mean, I know that you, Hege, you're focusing a lot on regenerative economy, and I'd like to start the discussion on that. Any views? Ernst, you're smiling. You want to get started?
I believe I'm the only one in this round who was a member of parliament. And I know how you feel if people don't vote for you. And the trouble is that what I said today would be an absolutely horrendous situation for my being re-elected.
Yes.
People don't want that. That is the reality of democracy, but not only, also of dictatorship, etc. So the trouble is that what I was trying to elaborate by itself, and Julia quite correctly criticized that, because it is unpopular. Or is it popular, Julia?
And I mean, it's interesting what you're saying, and I just want to make a quick reference and then pass on to you, Julia. I think that, and we have a workshop on post-fossil cities, which is a simulation game, and you wear the hat of different actors, and if you wear the hat of a politician, it's exactly that. If you come with something unpopular, you will not be voted again. And I think it's just interesting to be aware of this, and also business, right? You were talking about shareholders, some shareholder pressure. But I think we need to overcome this. And we'll come back to that later on, right? To say, okay, what are the solutions, or what are some of the possible solutions? Julia, you want to build on that?
Well, I mean, I know that being a politician is a tough job. There are, however, politicians who are getting reelected using these kinds of messages. The climate and ecological crises are reasonably obvious to lots of people right now. And what I've noticed is, at least when I talk about, I've been trying to talk to lots of different people over the last years, especially young people, especially, the Fridays for Future, the climate strikes, kids with really severe concern, and in some cases quite severe eco-anxiety, and seeing that there's a possible future with decent living conditions that would be within reach, that changes life for them. So they are not, there is, I'm not saying this the entire generation, but there is a new generation that's coming up that is extremely good and thorough in their critique of capitalism, not at all a fan of growth, not at all a fan of overconsumption, for a large part of them in a way that was absolutely not true 10, 20 years ago. And they are certainly seeing this perspective very strongly. And I don't think that this is, you could say, well, this is a marginal thing. You're talking to, a small percentage. I was at a conference last week where Kohei Saito presented his book on Marx and the Anthropocene. It's a bestseller in Japan. It was a bestseller last week. I think the German edition came out and it topped the charts. I mean, people are ready for new ideas, and people are ready for radically different proposals because they can see that the current direction is a disaster. And so I think that that's something that we should not underestimate either. The other point on the popularity of consumer society and the desire for consumption is that this is something that was created. It's a overconsumption is a deliberate product of an overproductive industrial society. Consumer society is about 100 years old, not more. And in terms of what that overproductive society or that overproductive industry did to create overconsumption that corresponded to overproduction, that's something that's documented in environmental sociology and theories of Schneiberg and Gold, like the treadmill of production. So we know that this kind of dynamic exists. And I would really not take it as human nature, because human nature, the creation of consumer society, it's something that had to be made because people did not want to consume enough. And I really don't think that we can take this as a historic inevitability. We have to take the work of people like Edward Bernays and Milton Friedman and Hayek and all of these people who created the world that we live in seriously. They worked hard to make a complete unequal disaster, and we're going to have to work hard to unmake their work, but we cannot take it as an inevitability or as a law of nature.
Okay, you want to?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Great, thank you. No, we do consumer research every year, and we've just got new research coming out in a month or so. But from 2022, 72% of the people we surveyed want to consume less. So there is a not just a feeling of guilt, but there's a sense of collective responsibility. So there is that, but help me do it. So we've seen this for a long time now, that there is to some degree, willingness to change and take action. There is an intention action gap with certain demographics, certain age groups, but they want help and they want business to help and make it easy, affordable, and desirable. But of course, there is a dimension of, as a business, we need to translate the sufficiency concept into language that makes sense to the business. Otherwise, it just switches my CFO off or my commercial manager off. So there's a real sort of translation job, both with our customers, but also our co-workers. We have a young co-worker base. And of course, they don't want to work for a company that's not taking overconsumption seriously. So we see the pressure coming in all directions, and rightly so. But there is, for me as a sustainability practitioner within a big global company, you have to find the right lever to really, for the CFO, it might be the resilient business for the future and making sure that we're doing the right thing for the right reason, but nevertheless, also supporting the business to thrive within the boundaries, of course. And this is part of the challenge, and I think we touched on this earlier. Within a corporate context, we are inundated right now, and again, rightly so, for all the right reasons, with legislation, mandatory reporting, various frameworks. And the risk at the moment is that if we enter in with another one that doesn't quite align or doesn't allow us to deliver, people will switch off. So there's a real need that we translate that in the right way in order to create the action that we need.
Okay. Luis, you were also talking about, we need a new dictionary to reframe, we need to rethink. And do you think, how does this new dictionary need to look like?
I'm reflecting on the popularity contest in vocabulary, and it seems a bit, if we accept that we are at a juncture where we fundamentally need to change. If we take that as a premise, it doesn't leave us that many options. We had options in the 60s and the 70s. We could have had multiple possible directions. We squandered that. We're now at a place where we don't have as many options as we know. We know this. So tinkering around a popularity contest, to me, is accepting a decision that a certain segment of the world is going to get lost. Or be it, and it's not just humans, it's also biodiversity and a lot more. We should remember it's a small fraction of the world that is enjoying the wealth that we're exposed to right now. It's not the majority of the world. We are an exception, by far an exception, in North America and Europe, Japan, and Australia. The majority of the world does not have it. And we've deliberately sold our image of what that good life is to them, and are convincing them to cross over into that territory against their own traditions, cultures, beliefs, institutions, to move into ours in a way that they're only suppliers of labor and resources and every other thing to our own consumerism, rather than participating as in an equitable way in that society. This sounds to me a very demoralizing conversation to have if we're going to take this dynamics. There are two things we need to face in this. One, accept that what we now call democracies have been captured by corporations. And if we accept that, it means we're beginning to recognize that we're not being governed by the people we voted for. That has to change. The second one is we need to fundamentally revisit what the role of a business is in society. It is not just to extract resources and pass them around and then get shareholder wealth and all of that. It is there to contribute to the well-being of society. Once you rethink that, things like shareholder ownership, profits, all this very perverse vocabulary that fits this infrastructure becomes completely useless. The fundamental question becomes, how do we work with each other to make sure that the resources we have are distributed in a way that all support us, to have a well-being society, stronger, resilient communities, and something positive to aspire towards.
Yes, Carlos.
Yeah, I would like to elaborate a little bit on what has been said. First, by saying we face a challenge of what is the nature of the challenge. In my view, it's a civilizational shift, nothing less than that. And it's not a technical or techno-economic plus political adaptation. It's definitely a big change in our cultures. They say cultures in plural, which will happen anyway. You know, but it might happen in a very, very painful way. It is happening in a very, very painful way. Or we could try, and I think this is our mission in a way, to try what are the pathways to make this shift not so painful. And knowing that actually the criticality of the situation is what opens the space of possibilities. You know, it's what makes that we are in search for that alternative, which according to Mrs. Thatcher did not exist or does not exist. Of course, the alternatives exist. But the big question is, how do we learn what we already know? Because I don't disagree. I mean, not only that I don't disagree, I very much agree with what Julia and Luis have said. The problem is, how do we learn what we already know? Meaning, how do we change according to the knowledge we already have, while in spite of the fact that, yes, the beneficiaries of the existing system are a small minority in the world, the dominance of their culture is much more widespread. So people who don't have the means to enjoy the benefits of consumerism aspire to consumerism and act politically according to that aspiration, which would mean against their own interests. But then another dimension is that we don't know what will work. So in my view, all initiatives are much welcome. This is also why in the Club of Rome we try different things of different nature. But I think for sure it's not only the definition of solutions by a small group of enlightened people, whether the Club of Rome or any other organization, and offer those solutions to the politicians to apply that. We already tried that 50 years ago with the limits to growth, and it didn't work. And the question is much more about how do we create the conditions to enroll very large fractions of society in the process, knowing that they are in very different spaces, culturally speaking, and value and regarding their values. And to me, the idea that we can win, that this is a battle to be won at the political stage, us against them, some of that might be helpful, but overall, I don't see the shift happening that way, because that will create very painful situations, and that has the potential to block everything. I will just put an example. I happen to advise the Swiss program of research on energy transition, SWIT, which is planning, you know, the transition to 100% renewables and lower levels of consumption of energy in this country in 2050. The discussion which is ongoing in the context of this program is, how do we connect with the values of the minority, yes, but important minority, who are not convinced even of that climate change exists? We might find that stupid, but my take is that we have to bet on the humanity and the capacity of everybody, all across the board. Because if we say, no, but the problem is that we have 30% of the population in Switzerland who are simply stupid and do not understand, or just in their vested interests, that might be a political diagnosis, but it's not a practical solution. to address them and to avoid that they block the changes. So what are the values through which we connect also? And this is where comes the idea of these mutual metamorphoses.
Okay. Luis, you want to add up on this?
I was just thinking, one thing to also be clear about is also what we are, what we're asking for. So, and not get distracted by what needs to be done. I'll give a typical example. You've just given a wonderful example of how IKEA has green products and is trying to reach out to green consumers, and it's difficult because the space for competition is challenging. If we spend time demanding green products from companies rather than realizing that corporations, the way they're founded and run, are essentially problematic, then we're missing the point. So if we create bodies that are licensed and allowed to pilot and to distribute unevenly with completely distorted value systems, it is fundamentally problematic. No matter how many green products they bring out, that problem remains, and it gets deeper and deeper. The second one here is, if we also spend a lot of time talking to the minority that does not believe in climate change, we're completely distracted. We're disregarding all the science and evidence that is out there, and we're refusing to listen to the young people that are crying out and screaming against the lack of future possibilities. It is really, as you say, what values do we bring in addressing this issue? Until we're clear about those, we will run after the wrong things.
And I think this is a very good point. And I think it's really, I mean, I feel sometimes also we need to act now. We need to change now things. And Julia, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so it's interesting when Carlos raised the SWEET program, because I'm very grateful that the SWEET program is actually also funding some of my research. But as an aside, Switzerland likes to give, I mean, we're in Switzerland, so I'm gonna spend just a few minutes of our collective time to slag off Switzerland because it really deserves it, okay? So hang on to your seats. Switzerland is positioning itself as a climate rogue state at the heart of Europe. This is not doing it in a democratic way. So we have these nice research projects focused on our own consumption. How can our transport and residential sectors be made more green? Fantastic. Switzerland is also at the same time enthusiastically upholding the Energy Charter Treaty. Quick show of hands, who in this room has heard of the Energy Charter Treaty? Yeah, you all need to do your homework, except for those who raised your hands. The Energy Charter Treaty is a vehicle, an internationally binding vehicle under the World Trade Organizational rules, with binding tribunals that protects the fossil fuel industry, energy companies in general, but the fossil fuel industry specifically, against climate action. So climate policies taken by other European countries can be destroyed because a fossil fuel company has its headquarters in Switzerland. The European Union is trying to get out, and Switzerland is staying in deliberately, explicitly, because it hopes that multinational corporations will come here, pay a little taxes, make us look cool, employ some people, and destroy our neighbors' climate policies through international legislation, okay? So that's one of the things that Switzerland is explicitly doing this year, is insisting on staying in this treaty. Switzerland is also a hub of petroleum trading. This is one of the biggest businesses in Geneva, specifically, as big as the banking sector. It is also a hub of raw resource material extraction, but with companies like Glencore, Trafigura, and Vitol. And so I think that one of the things we really need to understand is to what extent we're facing nation states as citizens and consumers, and to what extent we're facing nation states that are in thrall to multinational corporations and doing their bidding. So Switzerland, on one side of the coin, is sort of pretending to be a democracy and trying to do things better for its citizens. On the other side, it's basically just running with the rogues. It's basically running with the companies that need to disappear. And Thanks. Because Heike was saying my company shouldn't disappear. It's quite possible that IKEA shouldn't disappear. Making furniture is actually a socially relatively useful function compared to these other companies that are much bigger and better. But some companies in some sectors do need to disappear. And what some of our governments are doing is very much standing for them rather than for us.
And yeah, thanks, Julia, for that. And I think it goes in the same line. I think globally there have been lots of subsidies going into oil and gas. And I mean, if we would use that money for just to conserve biodiversity, we would be much better off. So I think we have these controversies. I'm just looking at the time, and I just want to ask the audience, do you have any questions that you like to raise to the panel? Yes, please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Maybe say who you are.
Magdalena. I'm a PhD student at Humboldt University in Berlin. I'm wondering, it's a question to everyone really on the panel. To what extent would you agree that success prevents sufficiency on human level and also organizational level? I feel that many of us, myself including, we strive for success. And the Financial Times, for example, they have a supplement called How to Spend It. So I think there's a tendency for all of us to be able to spend money in one way or another. So to what extent would you agree that this is the main problem of sufficiency, of achieving sufficiency? Thank you.
Okay, yes, thank you. So in how far do you think success prevents sufficiency? Anyone wants to? Yes.
Let me inject something not popular. There is a major difference between popularity of saying the right things and popularity of what is practically being done. It is perfectly easy if I was, for instance, a member of the Green Party, to say, we want, like the Fridays for Future, we want a really good Earth planet, and we have to work at it, etc. This is extremely popular to say. But what economically minded politicians do is the opposite. And I happen to see it in Germany that the Green Party at the last election was extremely successful, and now it's going down and down and down and down, because they are supposed to do a practical thing, and that is unpopular. Not what they say, but what the other people in parliament are saying. So we have to distinguish popularity among the people who are in this room and popularity with the so-called populists, of whom nobody is here in this room. But the number and the percentage of people becoming radical populists is growing, not shrinking. And that is the problem.
Any other views? Or one more question from the panel, and then we from the plenary, and then we will, okay, we have 2 questions. I take, so many questions. I can't take all of them because we are almost done, but let's start here and then there in the back.
Thank you very much for the panelists and for the other questions. I'm from Germany, from the PTX Lab Lausitz. I want to ask the whole panel maybe, I think I agree what Ernst-Ulrich von Weizsäcker said. Even if we have the youngsters on the streets, they have not the majority in elections. And in Germany, I live in Brandenburg. This is an area where coal mining was very popular. And now we have this structural change. And the right populist parties gain 30% of the votes. So yes, we can use these buzzwords of energy transition and well-being for everyone and a good green planet. But if the wrong people are elected in the government, they won't do anything to achieve this. So my question is, how can we address all these great issues to the people that make 30% in Germany, in East Germany, who do not want to get to be sufficient, or sufficiency, support sufficiency? How do we reach these people? They are so many, and if we don't get to them, we cannot change anything. This is my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we listen to the questions and then we try to address them together. Okay, so.
You mean me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just trying to listen. I haven't.
My name is Ottmar Deubse from UNITA. I think this whole discussion here is very interesting and also very important. And I think it's a very good analysis of where we are and where we go if we continue to do of what we used to do in the past decades. There are also some hints to how we could change this way. So I think this is everything there. What I think is missing is we are somehow like people telling other people, here you have a black long tunnel. It's dark, but you have to go through. But we cannot, it might even be dangerous, but you have to pause it. But we cannot tell them what is behind this tunnel. Of course, we know some figures, minus 40% in or minus 60% energy consumption. So, but what does this mean for their daily lives then? How would this look like? So maybe what we would need is a kind of a novel of some skilled writers saying, this is how such a society could look like, because we know very well where we live in now. But in the end, we have no idea what our lives would be after this transition.
Okay, thank you. Yes, one more question there, and then.
Hi, my name is Louis Herrmann, and I have a question to Hege in regard to IKEA. What we would need, from my point of view, is one set of furniture for the whole lifetime. So could you develop a business model where one person gets one set of furniture for every generation may get a set of furniture, and still IKEA may continue to exist? Can you imagine a leasing or a rental agreement? You produce furniture that lasts 100 years and I lease it through my lifetime, and I don't need to go to your shops and buy new things.
Thank you very much. One last question there.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for coming in so late. My name is Alex Graf. I'm from Kumi Consulting, and I have a question on actually something that figured in different presentations, namely the point on, well, circularity, on kind of more recycled content, moving away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, etc., as an important aspect, solution, part of sufficiency. One may even, to a certain extent, read the definition that we saw from Ms. Steinberger in this direction. I assume this is not intended, but if you want, I guess you could understand it that way. So basically, sufficiency as resource efficiency. Now, when you go to a European policy context, for example, but not just Europe, you can talk to economists, policymakers all over. These are exactly the same narratives, actually, circularity, resource efficiency, etc., that you will hear in order to argue and justify actually economic growth. So as a newcomer to sufficiency, my simple question would then be, what's the difference? And how do we go beyond that, actually, if growth is not the answer? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have heard, about politicians, or how do we make sure the right people are being voted. We have heard about we need a novel to understand how the future will look like. We need furniture that will be there so for 100 years, or we can use them for 100 years. and then also, yeah, the concept of sufficiency. I'd like to close the panel in a way that I'd like to ask each of you to tell us really also a little bit, what are, in your view, the key recommendations that either business, politicians, governments, or also individuals need to do in order that we achieve a just and nature positive, climate neutral world? I think that's what we are hopefully all aiming for. But Carlos, do you want to start? And I'll go along the panel.
Well, as I said before, we don't know what will work. So we have to be imaginative, and I think that rather than identifying the goals or the future we want, we have to work on the way, on how we walk. Because again, this is a matter of a civilizational shift, this is a matter of cultural change. If cultural change happens, policy making will follow, because it will become obscene to do some of the things that we do today, but people, or most of people, will consider that obscene. Now, we don't know how to create cultural change, but in my view, there is a fundamental thing that we don't have to fall into the same traps of modernity. Modernity with a capital M is fundamentally built on separation, on drawing borders, on defining us and them, so that we are morally superior and we can exploit them. We have to try something else. Because if we think of, we want to have a more collaborative world and less competitive world, but we are betting on extremely competitive instruments like day-to-day politics. And we also work on these, the role of the younger generations has been mentioned several times. I fully agree, but it's not enough to bet on, yeah, the younger generations will fix that. I also very much trust women to be part of the fixing, but it is in the how. And the how is that, sorry to say, we need a much broader base. I mean, we are in a sort of bubble here in this room, but there are plenty of people out of this bubble. We need a much broader base for that cultural change. And you don't recruit fans by blaming them for their behavior and much less for their feelings. So often the rhetoric of what we are trying to do, I include myself in that, is framed in a way that we blame some people for not being aware of, not recognizing climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Blaming people and blaming their feelings is not the right way. So the tone has to be very different and the invitation has to be very different.
Thank you, Carlos. Ernst, any last thoughts from your side, specifically maybe also recommendations for politicians of?
I'm, of course, with my mentality in favor of what Julia and Louis have been saying. Of course, this is wonderful. But with your question, what a politician will do is a different matter. He needs to be re-elected, you know. And much of what we in this room want leads to losing the next elections. And I mean, you have been saying it from Brandenburg, but that is not the only thing. I mean, in Britain, you have part of that problem. You have in the US, you have it even in China. And so having majorities in those 4 countries or so is a different animal from saying the right things. Now, when I became member of parliament, my first wish was an ecological tax reform, making the destruction of natural things more expensive, period. That was extremely unpopular, of course. But then the then Minister of Finance was in favor in case we can use the fiscal income for reducing labor costs. And that led to a situation where Germany, by accepting the ecological tax reform, saved and created 600,000 additional jobs. So I made the the minister made the unpopular proposal into a popular proposal. So that is one thing. And the second was renewable energies. My friend Hermann Scheer said, we need a law for renewable energies. And then I said, that's a great idea. But how the hell can we make that popular? And he then referred to the economies of scale, meaning that if everybody goes for renewables and is paid for doing it, we will win. And the effect was that in a matter of 20 years, the price of a kilowatt hour of renewables was reduced by a factor of 20, you know, from 2 Deutschmarks into 5 euro cents.
And I mean, that shows also the importance of the regulatory framework.
Right.
Ernst, I'm sorry, we have to continue.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Hege, maybe just to quickly address also the question about the furniture.
Yeah, no, I'll be brief. Of course, the situation is that people do and politicians do listen to big business, and we will not be able to redesign our own way of operating at this point, but we can lend our weight and our voice to legislators to ask for more stringent and higher standards for business, and that's certainly what we are doing. I think in terms of lifetime furniture, we've been testing services where you can lease your furniture for the whole life. We also have to make sure that people want what we offer. So there are lots of opportunities to continue to improve and innovate, I would say. And just a final piece, because I deal with co-workers and colleagues who work on the shop floor. We work with customers to come in and buy their sofas, their beds from us. They don't understand this conversation generally. They want it to be related to them. Not to say that it needs to be dumbed down, but it needs to speak to them. So I think there's an opportunity to shift the story and the narrative to bring people along. And businesses can do that. And of course, every other actor in this space can do that too. But that's certainly a role that a company like us could play.
Okay, thank you very much, Hege. Julia, any last thoughts from your side?
Sorry to be between you and the coffee break. I wanted to come back to this idea of the right-wing populism and this success impedes sufficiency. I think insecurity impedes sufficiency, and I think insecurity feeds right-wing populism, especially economic insecurity. And I think everybody needs to go back and read Polanyi, The Great Transformation, because it reads like an account of our times. He was talking about the economic roots behind the rise of fascism in Europe, and it's happening all over again. So his point was, when people are subjected to the excesses of a neoliberal market, he might not have used the word neoliberal, but that's basically what's happening. They will turn to fascism because they are suffering, and rather than facing an abstract economic and power structure, they will face the enemy, whether the enemy is shutting down a coal plant or whether the enemy is a foreigner or a migrant that they're told to hate or whatever. And so I think that that's one of the things that we have to take seriously. And that's why I think that going back to this idea of public services, making people economically secure and having a safe basis of life, like Lewis mentioned, that has to be decommodified, it has to be taken out of financial speculation, is the basis for a stable society where people do not turn towards these fears of their insecurity. And this is something you see all over the world. And I think that that's something that that businesses should also be taking seriously, right? That we all need to be taking seriously. And what does that mean in terms of political recommendations? Right now, we have democracies that are very feeble, that do the bidding of multinational corporations, like I just said, and that also stop at the edge of the market, because the market is sovereign, the market is king, the market is God. So our democratic decision-making does not impede on market decision-making. The most important decisions in our democracies are made in markets. So we have to take decision back. We have to give ourselves the power structures and the right to make market-based decisions. So I think if a buzzword to remember is economic democracy. What are structures at the organizational level, at the macroeconomic level that bring democracy into markets? I think that's really important. And no, resource sufficiency is absolutely not the same as resource efficiency. I think the easiest thing to do there is to go and have a look at the Negawatt Association and their scenarios to see what these different measures look like.
Thank you very much. Luis, your last words.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go back to the word you mentioned on values. And I think it seems to me as a, I was going to say community, but then we're not exceptional. We're just part of broader society. But for those of us that understand the science, that work in different organizations that are chattering this course, it is quite important to understand a distinction between the science and strategy and all those other things you're building around it. The science is very clear now, and we know what to avoid. So this conversation is not necessarily about a lot on disagreement. It's a lot on strategy or even perception. And that needs to get a little bit clearer. This is where I go to the whole point of values. We're really having a conversation about our future and who we are as a society. In this case, the values that we bring into this space becomes extremely important. Who you vote for tells a lot about your values. What you produce tells a lot about your values. What you invest in tells a lot about your values. What you research on as a researcher, don't spend time researching on willingness to pay. It's not going to do anything. Businesses have a lot of information on that. It can tell you more around it. So there's a lot that tells what your values is. But the only way we can express these values is if we have parameters and institutions that allow for these better sides to come out. If we still constrain our values and our expressions to materialism and institutions that are corrupt or institutions that were designed for marketplaces, all it limits us to is just consumers and consumerism. We need to shift from that.
So thank you all. Thank you for listening to us, also bearing with us into the coffee break. I'd like to thank the panelists really for this interesting discussion. I hope you got a lot of food for thought, maybe also some controversial discussions, and also some of the challenges that we are facing. Enjoy the coffee break, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.